James Delacorte had spent every one of those extra 40 minutes watching people celebrate the mega $200 million. The Midtown development deal had closed. Handshakes, backslaps the clink of water glasses, raised like champagne. Everyone in that conference room was smiling, and James smiled back. The right smile, the measured one. The smile that had taken
Alo, anh em xin chào. Bạn ơi, mình đón bạn ở bên công viên Thủ Lệ hay là bên giao thông vận tải nhỉ?
Without giving away that control, to the only thing he would ever
Ok, ok, bạn chờ mình tí nha.
He loosened his hand the moment the other
Ok, ok.
By the time he pushed through the lobby onto Titanic Street, the October air met him like something he had forgotten. New Orleans held its heat the way it held everything, stubbornly, past the point when the rest of the country would long. He waved off his driver without explanation. He needed to walk. He always needed to walk after days that felt enormous on the outside and hollow on the inside. I was halfway down the block when he stopped. She was sitting on the front steps of the Meridian building, his building, the one his company had spent 3 years and $80 million bringing out of the ground, the one that had earned him an architectural award. He could not currently remember the name. She sat with her spine straight against the iron rail, as though dignity were a thing you carried in your posture when everything else had been taken. Her coat was the kind of thing that told a whole story without a single word. Her shoes had walked more miles than shoes ought to last. And in her lap, pressed to her chest with both hands, she held a worn notebook, its cover softened by time and weather, its edges curved like the pages of something read 1,000 times. She was not looking at anything in particular. She was simply present, the way very old people sometimes are, as if they had finally stopped fighting and connected. James stood on the sidewalk and looked at her for a moment that lasted longer. Then he crossed the street to the corner shop, bought 2 roast beef po' boys, a bottle of water, and a color of red beans and rice. He did not examine the entrance, only followed it and walked back across the street for her. Excuse me, ma'am. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Have you eaten today? She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and unhurried, the kind that had witnessed a great deal, and somewhere along the way decided not to be diminished by anything. She studied his face, the way people do when they are in no particular rush to form an opinion. I was just about to take that up with the Lord, she said. And then she smiled, warm, unguarded, the kind of smile that costs something to give when the world has been. He sat down beside her, on the steps of his own building. Right there, on the stone in the soup, he handed her the food, and she accepted it with both hands, carefully, the way you receive something that matters. The afternoon light turned green across the garden district as they ate together. She told him she had spent her whole life in New Orleans, born and raised in Tremaine, taught music for more years than she sometimes did. She talked about the neighborhood the way people talk about someone they have held for a long time, with tenderness for what it was, provided used to be every soul on the block, she said, her voice low. You left your door open in the summer. Children played outside until the street lights said otherwise. She pulled apart a piece of bread slowly. Then the money came in and the memory went out. That's how it always goes. James listened. Not the way he listened in meetings, scanning for opportunity and calculating response, but actually listened the way he had not done in longer than he wanted to say. At some point, she asked what he did. Real estate, he said. She glanced at the building behind them, then back at him. A quiet recognition passed across her face, not accusation, something gentler than that. The acknowledgement of an irony that was too old and too familiar to be worth naming out loud. She let it rest between them without making it heavy. The street grew quieter. The light shifted. Somewhere down the block, a rasping was warming up the low road of a trombone, drifting through the evening air like something the city exhaled naturally, the way other cities exhale traffic noise and wind. James was reaching for his jacket when the old woman's voice dropped to something just above a whisper. She was not looking at him. She was looking out at the street at something only she could see. And she said in English, the way you say a prayer you have repeated so many James Delacroix lay completely still. He did not turn back. He did not speak. He stood there on the sidewalk with the city moving around him in front of him. It had no hope. He was willing to give it. And after a moment that felt like a very long time, he left. The penthouse on the 38th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, and on most nights, James could see the stars. Tonight it felt like an accusation. He stood at the glass with his jacket on, and the shirt untucked, a glass of bourbon in one hand that he had poured and not touched, and he looked out at New Orleans the way a man looks at something he has spent his whole life trying to own, and still does not quite believe belongs to him. The city stretched below in every direction. He heard touching the light like a slow, dark river. The spires of the French River to the east. The low, long and now moving to the dawn. From up here, it looked toward me. Like something I knew better. At 41, James Delacroix was the founder and chief executive of Delacroix Development, a state company, active projects, and a portfolio that the business plans had recently run and somewhere more. He had built it from nothing, and less than from a starting point. Most people did not see it, let alone build it. His name was on luxury towers and mixed-use developments and waterfront properties from here to the Carolina coast. He had been called a visionary by people who used that word. He ate dinner alone most nights. He had no one to call except for him, and no one who called him except for him. His life was enormous on paper and very quiet in practice, and most days he had made a kind of peace with it. Most days he set the bourbon down on the windowsill and pressed his palm flat against the glass. The city pulsed below him, indifferent and alive, and something the old woman had said the way she had said that one word, barely above a breath, moved through him like a current he could not locate the source of. I had been 8 years old the last time anyone had said his name that way. August 29th, 2005. He did not need to look up the date. It was the kind of date that would say, not the memory, the kind you feel in your chest before your mind has even finished waking. The storm had come the way everyone said it would, and no one truly believed it would. The water came after, and that was the part no forecast had prepared anyone. Not the wind, not the rain, but the water, patient and enormous and indifferent to everything in its path. It came into their neighborhood on the north side of Treme before dawn, gray and silent, rising against the basements, and then the windowsills, and then the doorframes, with a calm that was more frightening than any noise could have been. His mother had gotten him to the roof. That much he remembered clearly.
21.000 được khuyến mại 2.000 được 19.000 anh ạ.
Her voice steady, in a way he would not understand until he was much older. The particular kind of steady that costs everything a person has. They had waited on that roof for 2 days. Neighbors on neighboring rooftops. The sound of helicopters that came close and then didn't. When help finally came, they were taken to a relief shelter outside Baton Rouge, a converted warehouse where cots were lined up in rows that seemed to go on forever, where the air smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and human exhaustion, and where his mother, who had been steady through the water, in the roof, in the waiting quietly, became someone he did not recognize. She had been strong for so long. In the shelter with nothing left to be strong for, her body simply stopped cooperating. She passed on a Tuesday. A volunteer nurse had held his hand. I had been placed with the state 2 weeks later. A caseworker with tired eyes and a clipboard had explained that there were no relatives who could take him. He had nodded like he understood. He was 8 years old, and he understood nothing except that the world had become a place where the things you love disappeared without warning, without permission. 3 placements in 4 months. Each one a different house, a different set of rules, a different version of unwelcome, that adults delivered with varying degrees of politeness. He had learned to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to ask for nothing. And then, on a November evening, so rainy, the street looked like a river. A caseworker he had not seen before drove him to a ground-floor apartment on the edge of Treme and knocked on a green door. The woman who opened it was somewhere in her 60s, with steady hands and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, in an expression that suggested she had been expecting him or someone like him for a very long time. She looked at him, standing in the
Tưởng bạn lại
rain,
dậy đi câu cá
with his
rồi.
single
May bạn lại
garbage
không đi
bag
câu
of
à?
belongings, and she did not say anything about
Mệt quá.
paperwork or house rules or what time dinner was.
Thế à?
She simply stepped back
Bạn
from the
phải ra khỏi
doorway
phòng
and
hít
said,
thở không khí trong
"Coming
lành
out of
đi.
that rain, baby.
Bạn
You're
ở
safe
trong
now."
phòng mãi
He had
toàn
not
mùi
cried since his
ấy.
mother. He did not cry then either. But something
Hít
in
thở
his
không khí
chest,
trong lành ấy.
some
Ra ngoài
tight
ngoài
knotted
sông ngoài
thing
ruộng
that had been holding
hít thở,
everything
hít
together
thở.
through the water and the shelter
Ra ngắm
and the
vitamin mãi.
placements loosened
Hàng
just
view nó
slightly.
vẫn là có
Just
sức
enough.
sống hơn
He
bạn.
had not thought about that night in 15 years. Now he couldn't think about anything else. To understand what Viola Arsenault
Đang ở Nguyễn
meant
Khang
to the
đây mà
boy,
ế khách quá
you
gọi
have
điện
to
bạn bảo để
understand
cho nó
what
xin
Treme
vé.
looked like in the fall of
Làm chuyến đi nội
2005.
bài.
It was a neighborhood that had taken the storm personally. Block
Chín
after
là
block
kém
of
20 à?
shotgun
18.
houses sat waterlogged and gutted their front stoops, thick with dried
Lao
mud.
tính rồi, 3 giờ
Their
bạn tóc
windows
đi
covered in
thì
blue
9 giờ là 6 tiếng rồi.
tarps
Thôi bạn dậy
smelled
rồi,
like October
chắc
wind,
mình gọi.
like flags of a country that no longer existed. Half the
Thế
families
thì
were
dậy
gone,
đi.
scattered
Nằm
to
ngủ cho sâu
Houston,
ấy.
to Atlanta, to relatives in
Nó cày
cities
mấy cổ
they had
ngủ
never
sâu ấy.
intended to visit. The ones who stayed moved through the streets with the particular quiet of people who have survived something
Thế thì
and
dậy
are
được
not
rồi,
yet
không
sure
xứng đáng ngủ
what
thêm.
to do with that.
Dậy được chơi.
Viola Arsenault
Mẹ
had
thì
stayed.
90.
She was 63 years old that autumn, though she moved through her days with the deliberate energy of someone who had not yet received permission
Hỏi cho
to
bạn
slow
bảo ý
down.
kiến đi cò thì
She had
không.
grown up in Treme, the daughter of a longshoreman and a seamstress, and she had spent 40 years teaching piano and music theory out of the front room of her house on
Nghe
Dawkins
hợp
Street,
lý nhỉ.
a house
Nghe
that
hợp
had
lý.
flooded to the windowsills and dried out and been cleaned by her own hands
Chưa.
over the 6 weeks following
Giờ
the
nó bắt đầu đi
She had not
rửa
left.
mà.
She had mopped
Nó cũng
and
ngủ như
scrubbed
mày
and
ấy.
hauled
Giờ nó dậy nó
ruined
rửa
furniture
mà.
to the curb, and then gone back inside
Có cả là bạn
and
đâu đến đêm đúng không?
which had
Bây giờ nó dậy nó rửa
survived
mà.
with only
Cậy
the
mà.
bottom keys warped and played a hymn to make sure the instrument still had a voice. It did. So she stayed.
Được rồi, nó
She
cậy mà
had
mắm
also
tôm
spent 30
ăn cho nó
years
có hương vị
showing
riêng.
up to city council meetings, organizing neighborhood cleanups, and making phone calls on behalf of people who did not know how to make them for themselves. She was not famous. She was simply
Hương
known
vị nó đặc trưng. Bạn hiểu không? Cứ
certain
mà nhắm tôm mà
neighborhoods
mắm tôm mà
are
mua
known
về hàng công
not
nghiệp
for
thì cái nào nó
anything
sẽ như thế nào?
particular
Làm sao
they
nó
have
gì đặc
done,
trưng?
but for the accumulated weight of having always been there. When the caseworker called about a placement, Viola said yes before the woman had finished the sentence. The boy
Thế là đúng gì
arrived
bà
on a
cô?
November evening with rain coming down in sheets in a single garbage bag that held everything he owned in the world.
Đấy.
He stood in her doorway and looked at her with the eyes of someone who had learned very recently
Thế à?
to
Nay
expect
không có
very
cháu à?
little. She
Con bảo,
recognized that.
ồ, bây giờ
She had
không
seen it
không
before
làm ăn
in
cái
other
gì cái là vợ
children, in
nó sẽ
other
nhìn
years.
ngay.
It was the look of a person who has stopped
Giá trị của
asking.
bạn,
She stepped back from the door.
giá trị của bạn.
Coming
Có
out
mì
of
đi
that
ăn,
rain,
ăn mì
baby.
đấy. Ăn mì.
You're safe now. The first week, he barely spoke. He sat at
Rất
her
rồi.
kitchen table
Rất
and
rồi
ate
thì,
what she put in front of him
chắc là cái
and
ăn
answered
đậu thôi.
questions with the smallest possible number of words. She did not push. She had learned long ago
Rất
that
rồi thì chắc
a
là ăn
child
đậu.
who has been through what this one had been through does not need to be coaxed into talking. He needs to be
Hợp lý
shown
nhỉ?
slowly and consistently that the floor is not
Thế bạn
so she cooked. She told
mấy
him
giờ
what
ăn
she
được
was
á?
doing while she
Cứ
did
ăn
it.
sớm
The way
được,
the
mai ăn
butter
sớm được,
needed
tại
to go
chiều ta
in
lại về sớm
before
đón
the
con.
onions. The way red beans needed to cool to get their flavor right. The way cornbread had to
Được,
rest
nhịn luôn
before
đi.
you cut into it, or it would fall apart. She talked and
10
he
giờ
listened,
bắt đầu bán rồi.
and that was enough for a while. The piano was what changed things. She had started playing in the evenings after
Ok,
supper
ăn
time.
sớm vậy.
Mostly old ones, her
Thế
own
nhá,
mother
bạn quay
had
tay
taught.
đi.
One night, she looked up from the keys and found him standing in the doorway of the front room arms, cross-watching.
Bạn có mang ghế
She did
không?
not comment.
Bạn đút
She
luôn ghế
simply
vào
shifted on the
đây.
bench
Bạn đút luôn
and
ghế vào
patted his
đây.
face beside her. He sat. She
Mày
placed his
quên.
hands on the keys.
Thế nhá.
She showed him
Đây
a
đây
simple
có gì
melody,
hỏi thăm em Thảo ra
4
cái nhé.
notes, nothing complicated, and told him to try. He tried. Every note was wrong. That's all
Rồi, đi lựa
right,
đây.
she said. The
Đấy.
heart doesn't need to be in tune to be heard. Try again. He tried again. Still wrong. She smiled anyway. By the end of 3 years, he could play the full melody of the song. She had taught him a slow, rolling thing she called a New Orleans lullaby. something her own mother had composed on a rainy afternoon before the boy's parents were even born. He played it badly, by any technical standard. He played it like it was the only true thing he knew how to say. Those 3 years held other things too. Supper every evening at a table set properly, even when it was just the two of them. Walks through Tremé on Saturday mornings while she pointed out which houses were coming back and which ones weren't. Conversations about what the neighborhood had been and what it still could be delivered with a conviction that made the boy believe she might be. On the hardest nights when something unnamed pressed down on him in the dark, she would sit on the edge of his bed and hum until his breathing steadied. She told him once, during one of those evenings, that the measure of a person was not what they accumulated, but what they refused to let go of. He had not fully understood it. The caseworker came on a Thursday morning in the spring of 2008. There had been a family, a couple in Baton Rouge, vetted approved stable. It was considered a good outcome. The paperwork had been in process for months. No one had told him. He stood in the front room with his garbage bag, the same one replaced twice, but always the same shape, and looked at Viola with an expression she would carry in her chest for the rest of her life. She walked beside him to the car. She kept her hand on his shoulder until the caseworker gently indicated it was time. She stood on the sidewalk as the door closed. She raised one hand. The car pulled away from the curb. She walked 3 steps after, then stopped because there was nothing else she could do. She stood on Dauphine Street and watched until the car reached the corner. The car turned the corner, and the street was empty. The street did not stay empty for long. Streets never do. Within a week, Viola had gone back to teaching. Within a month, she had taken on 2 new students, a pair of sisters, from 2 blocks over, whose mother worked double shifts at a laundry and needed somewhere safe for them to be in the afternoon. She charged what she always charged, which was whatever the family could manage, which was sometimes very little and sometimes nothing at all. She taught anyway. That was simply who she was. For the next 15 years, Viola Arsenault lived the way she had always lived, steadily, purposefully, rooted in Tremé, the way the old live oaks on Esplanade Avenue were rooted deep and quiet and seemingly immovable. She taught piano in her front room 6 days a week. She attended neighborhood association meetings. She brought food to elderly neighbors who could no longer manage their own groceries. She was the kind of person a community builds itself around, without ever quite acknowledging it is doing so. But the city around her was changing in ways that moved too fast for any one person to stop. It started slowly, the way these things always do. A coffee shop on the corner where the barber shop used to be. Then a boutique hotel, 2 blocks east, its lobby. All exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and a craft cocktail menu printed on reclaimed wood. Property values began to climb first, gradually, then sharply, then in a way that stopped making sense to the people who had lived there their whole lives. Families who had owned their homes for 3 generations began receiving letters from developers offering to buy. Some sold, some held on. One by one, the faces on the block changed, and the sounds changed too. The second-line brass that used to drift through open windows on Sunday afternoons, replaced by the quieter, more curated sounds of a neighborhood that was being redesigned for people who wanted the aesthetic of history without its inconvenience. Viola's students began to disappear, not all at once. A family relocated to New Orleans East because the rent had doubled. Another moved to Metairie. A third simply stopped showing up one week, and when she knocked on their door, the unit had already been repainted and listed on a rental app. By the time she counted, she had gone from 14 regular students to 4 in the space of 3 years. She adjusted. She took on adult students. She offered group lessons. She applied for a small arts grant from the city and was rejected twice before the program was eliminated entirely. She kept the lights on. She kept the piano tuned. And then came the letter. Not the letter she kept in the room. A different one entirely. A form letter from the pretty town professor's office, printed on official station, informing her that her property tax assessment had been recalled,
Trong người giàu
and that she owed a balance
thế nào là về chơi thế nào ở Việt hay nhỉ?
Penalties included daily.
Thuê được phòng chưa?
She read it 3
Thuê được phòng
times
chưa?
at her kitchen table. Then she called the number on the letter.
Vì bố tự thuê là bố không bao giờ thuê.
Before reaching
Tưởng anh, tưởng là ông ra ông quyết tâm thuê. Bố thuê là bố không bao giờ thuê.
in which was acknowledged, and then as far as she could tell, quietly says, she did not have a
Lên,
lawyer.
sáng em lên không? Sáng có lên mèo.
She went to a legal aid office
Thế là được. Ê, gặp bác kia.
and waited 2.5 hours. He was told her case was not a
Bây
priority,
giờ lên mà nó rất đuổi.
that the wait list for assistance was 8 months long. The second notice arrived on the 1st of November. What happened to Viola Arsenal over the following 18 months is not unusual. That was perhaps the most devastating thing across American cities where property values have surged, elderly homeowners grew, particularly those
Nhà
in
cũng
historic
không có
neighborhoods,
gì nhiều lắm đúng không?
have lost homes to taxes
Tầm vàng.
predatory assessments at rates that advocacy groups have been documenting for years. The paperwork is complex, the system is slow, and the people most affected are almost without exception people with the least access to the machinery.
Tưởng thuê được rồi để chiều em mà
Viola
ở
thought
cái phòng em
as far as she knew how to fight.
chưa ngủ nhờ.
She filed forms.
Mà tưởng thuê được rồi để buổi trưa em ngủ nhờ
She wrote a
nữa.
letter to her
Chưa thuê được
supervisor
thôi.
representative that was answered with a form response. She went to a community, spoke for 4 minutes, and was thanked for her kindness. The eviction order was
Yên
processed
tâm,
on a Wednesday.
bố còn lâu.
She had 30 days. She spent those 30 days doing what needed to be done with a quietness that the neighbors
Đi Than Thiên đúng không?
later described as the kind of calm
Đấy nhá, em bận cả khách rồi.
something that was not imagined into a place without a neighbor. She gave away her furniture. She told us the reading chair to the church. She arranged for her plants to be taken in. On the last morning, she moved through the house one final time. She ran her hand along the piano keys without pressing anything down. She stood in the doorway of the room where she had taught for 4 decades and looked at it for a long time. Then, she picked up the worn notebook from the piano bench. The only thing she had decided, without examining the decision too closely, that she would not leave behind, and pressed it against her chest. She walked out. She did not look back. She carried it everywhere. She never explained why not even to herself. Thursday came in no way. Most. Thursdays did with an hour, full of things that needed doing in a city that had already been awake for hours. By the time James reached his office on the 22nd floor, his assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Keisha, who had worked with him for 6 years and had learned to read his silences better than most people, read words, had his coffee waiting, and his morning briefing stacked in order of urgency. He thanked her, sat down, and began to work through it the way he always did, methodically, without ceremony, moving from item to item with the focused momentum of a man who had built his entire adult life on the discipline of forward motion. The Riverside Quarter File was third on the stack. It was a significant project, a mixed-use development on a parcel of land in the lower section of Trimmer 12, residential units above ground floor commercial space. The kind of mid-scale development his firm had been doing well for the past several years. The environmental review had cleared. The permits were in process. The file contained the standard documentation, architectural drawings, contractor bids, soil assessments, and the displacement report, a list of all properties affected by the acquisition, compiled by the city assessor's office. In coordination with his acquisitions team, he opened the displacement report because it was part of his standard review. Always writing, he had built that habit early in the year and was still the only person in the room making decisions because he believed that a developer who did not know exactly what he was displacing was a developer who would eventually displace something he could not take back. He started at the top of the list and read down 14 addresses, small properties, most of them former single-family homes, a few multi-unit rentals, one commercial was listed as Viola A. Arsenault, age 77. Acquired the property in 1991. Property subject to tax lien and subsequent acquisition. Following non-payment of disputed assessment, James Regan trust. Then he closed the file and placed both hands flat on his desk and looked at the wall across from him. The wall he stood. He walked to his office door and closed it. Something he did perhaps 3 times a week, and then he returned to his desk and opened the file to the final page of the displacement correspondence. It was a standard authorization his acquisitions like water through a pipe, review signed, file, forgotten. The signature at the bottom belonged to his business partner of 7 years, the co-founder of Arduino Code, the man whose instinct and connection helped build financial architecture that made projects like Riverside Court possible. Vincent Arduino. James looked at that signature a long time. He thought about the woman on the steps of his window. He thought about the way she had held that worn notebook against her chest. He thought about the 4417 Dawson Street address, sitting 9 miles down on a displacement pipe that had passed through how many hands before reaching his desk on Tuesday. He pulled out a separate note, not his voice's, notebook, a personal one that he kept in the bottom drawer and wrote down 3 things: the address, the number, the signature. Then he picked up his personal cell phone, not his work phone, and sent a single text message to a number he had used twice before for matters that required discretion. He set the phone face down on the desk. Vincent had known. The question was how much and how long. He left the office at 4:30 without telling anyone where he was going. That was unusual enough that Keisha glanced up from her desk as he passed coat over one arm, personal phone in his pocket instead of his work phone. He gave her a look that said nothing was wrong and everything was fine, which was the same look he gave in board meetings when something was neither of those things. And she let him go without a word, because she had worked with him long enough to know the difference between a man who needed to be stopped and a man who needed to be let. He stopped at Dookie Chase's before himself, a New Orleans institution, the kind of place that could make beautiful food through every version of itself for decades, the kind of place that smelled like history, and Sunday afternoons, and something for grandmother. He ordered red beans and a serving of fried rice, 2 pieces of cornmeal, and a cup of red pudding with whiskey sauce. He paid in cash and drove the rest of the way to Tremont with the windows down the warm October air, hearing the smell of the food through the car, like a memory he hadn't known he was chasing. She was where he had left her the day before.
Alo, anh em xin chào. Bạn ơi, mình đón bạn ở bên công viên Thủ Lệ hay là bên giao thông vận tải nhỉ?
Back against the brick wall of a building that had once been
Ok, bạn chờ mình tí nha.
and was now waiting outside. She had a coat on, despite the warmth, and the warm wind was in her lap, and she was watching the street with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned to find interest in whatever the world offered. She recognized him before he was fully stopped. "You again," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite surprise and not quite expectation, but landed somewhere comfortable between the two. "I brought food," he said, which was obvious, and she smiled at him for saying it anyway. They ate together as the afternoon softened into early evening, the light going amber and then gold across the old rooftops of Tremont. She told him about the neighborhood, the way someone tells you about a person they have loved for a very long time, with the particular combination of pride and grief that comes from watching something change past the point of recognition. She talked about the second lines that used to roll down these streets on Sunday afternoons, the brass bands and the handkerchiefs, and the whole neighborhood moving together like one living thing. She talked about the corner store that had been run by the same family for 3 generations before the building was sold to a developer 2 years ago. She talked about her students, the children who had sat at her piano bench over 40 years, whose names she still remembered, whose progress she had tracked, the way a garden tracks the growth of something she has tended. James listened. He did not check his phone. He did not think about the file on his desk or the signature
ngay.
at the bottom of the authorization document, or the text of the old man who was waiting for his next job. He simply sat in the sauna in the early evening and listened to an old woman talk about a place she liked. At some point, without planning to, he nodded toward the notebook in her lap. What's that, he asked. Her hands moved around him immediately, with both palms pressing it flat against her legs. A gesture so automatic it did not seem like a decision. Old things, she said. Her voice did not change, but something in her posture did a slight phrasing, the way a building was below, shifts 2 degrees without quite shutting. Important old things. She looked at him for a moment. Everything I kept is important, she said. Everything I didn't keep wasn't worth carrying. He did not ask again. He understood in the way that some things communicate themselves without requiring explanation, that the notebook was not a subject she was prepared to open, and that pressing further would break something in the conversation that was worth more than any answer she gave. They sat in silence afterward, and the silence was easy, in the way that silence between two people can occasionally be not empty, not awkward, but full of the kind of mutual presence that doesn't require honesty. The street darkened into a graduate. A group of musicians settled in the box of the and began to play a slow, low jazz style that drifted across the intersection and settled around him like waves. Eventually, James stood up. He brushed off his slacks and reached into the bag for the bread pudding, which had gone slightly cold, and left it next to her with a bottle of water. I'll come back, he said. You keep saying it, she replied. And you keep doing it. So I suppose I believe you. He turned to go. He had taken 2 steps, and something made him pause. Not a sound, not a word, just a shift in the quality of the air behind him, the particular stillness that sometimes means someone is looking at him. I glanced back. She was looking at his hands, not his face, not the street, his hands, hanging at his sides. She studied them for a long moment, with an expression he could not read from where he stood. Not recognition, exactly. Not confusion, exactly. Something that existed in the space between the two. Then she looked away, back to the street, back to wherever she went, and she was looking at something motionless. She said nothing. He walked to his car. He got in. He sat in the dark with the engine off, and the bread pudding smell faded, and the jazz from the corner, drifting through the cracked window, and he stayed there longer than he could explain. James Delacroix sat in his car and died. He and my own in the dark for a long time. I didn't know why he couldn't be. I had chosen to make a shop delivery. A coffee shop on Magazine Street that was busy enough to be anonymous, but quiet enough to hear a conversation without raising a voice. A place where 2 men sitting across from each other over coffee looked like Cooper Hayes arrived 3 minutes early, which was his time. He was a compact man in his late 50s, the kind of person whose face gave away very little, and whose eyes gave away even less. He had spent 12 years as an investigator with the Louisiana State Police before leaving to work privately, and he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago the less we knew, the more other people knew. James had used him twice before once, in a background check, on a potential partner that had uncovered a pattern of financial misrepresentation once for a due diligence meeting that had quietly resolved before it became something larger. Cooper did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not offer opinions. He did not bring precedents. He was, in James's estimation, precisely the kind of person he wanted, and the thing he needed to know was the kind of thing other people preferred to keep. James slid a folder across the table. In there was a copy of the displacement report from the Riverside Court of Appeal, with 14 addresses and the pattern of tax assessment discrepancies. He had identified the morning before. I need to know how this happened, James said. Not the paperwork version, the real version. Cooper opened the folder and read without expression. He turned pages slowly, the way someone reads when they are not reading for the first time, but confirming what they already suspected. How far back do you want me to go? Cooper asked. As far as it goes. Cooper nodded and closed the folder. Give me 48 hours. He called back in 36. They met again at the same table, Same time of morning, same 2 cups of coffee that neither of them paid much attention to. Cooper set a second folder on the table, thicker this time, the edges already slightly worn from being ironed. The short version, Cooper said, is that this is not new and it is not isolated. What you have on those 14 addresses is a pattern that goes back 6 years and covers somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 properties across 3 neighborhoods, Treme, the 7th Ward, and parts of Central City. All of them share the same basic profile. Long-term owners, predominantly elderly, predominantly African American, properties that have been in the same family for decades, in some cases generations. James was quiet. He had suspected something like this. Suspecting it and hearing it, stated plainly, were 2 different experiences. The tax assessment errors are not random, Cooper continued. They follow a consistent methodology assessments, recalculated at rates that trigger penalty accumulation.
Anh 21.000 được khuyến mại 2.000 và 19.000 anh ạ.
Respond to, particularly owners who don't have legal representation and don't know how to navigate the dispute process. By the time a lien is issued, the back amount is typically large enough that the owner cannot resolve it without either selling or losing the property outright. And the acquisitions that follow, acquired at distressed prices, sometimes through intermediary holding companies that take a couple of steps to trace back to the same source. Cooper paused. To Vincent Ardouin's network, to be specific. Though I want to be clear, what I have right now is a pattern, not a chain of evidence. The connections are real. Proving intent is a different matter. James absorbed this without speaking. He looked out the window at Magazine Street, moving through its Friday morning people, walking dogs, a delivery truck, double parked the lane, pushing a stroller past a row of shotgun houses that looked from the outside, exactly like the ones on the displacement. There's something else, Cooper said. He turned to a page near the back of the folder. It was a property record, the entry for 4417 Dauphine Street. Beside it, in Cooper's handwriting, was a name with a question mark. Raymond Arsenault. His name appears in a notation on the processing documentation for that address, Cooper said. I haven't been able to establish exactly what his connection to the property is. Could be a relative, could be something administrative, could be coincidence. I flagged it because the last name matches the owner of record, and I thought you'd want to know. James looked at the name for a long moment. Raymond Arsenault. The same last name as Viola. The same uncommon last name that he had never encountered in any other context in 41 years of living in this city. Is there a relationship between him and the owner of record? James asked. I don't know yet. Like I said, I flagged it. Could be nothing. James looked at the name again. It did not feel like nothing. Find out everything you can about Raymond Arsenault. Everything. Cooper nodded and left. James sat alone at this table with his untouched coffee, going cold,
Bạn phải ra khỏi phòng lên hít thở không khí trong lành đi.
that he didn't yet
Bạn ở trong phòng mãi bạn mùi ấy.
with the particular softness that October
hít thở không khí trong lành
offers New
ấy. Ra ngoài bờ
Orleans
sông bờ
as
ruộng.
a kind of apology for the summer, the light coming in at a lower
Ra
angle,
ngắm vitamin
the air
gái.
carrying just enough
Hàng view nó vẫn
coolness
là
to make the
rất
warmth
sông
feel
hơn bạn.
intentional rather than oppressive. He had looked up Dookie's hours that morning before he was fully awake, which told
Đang
him
Nguyễn Khang
something
này mà
about
ế
where
khách
his
quá gọi điện
mind
bạn
had
bảo để
already
cho nó
decided to go
xin vía.
before the rest of him had caught up.
Làm chuyến
He
đi lộ
stopped at
bài.
Gabrielle on Esplanade, one of the oldest Creole kitchens left in the
9
neighborhood,
giờ kém
the kind of
20
place where the
18.
recipes had not changed in 3 generations, because there was no reason to change something
Giao tính
that
rồi,
had
3
already
giờ bạn
arrived
đọc
at
đi
the truth.
thì 9 giờ
He
là 6
ordered
tiếng
gumbo,
rồi.
a
Thôi
plate of
dậy
smothered
rồi,
chicken potato
em
salad, and 2 servings of bread pudding, and he carried it all to Treme in a paper
Thế thì dậy
bag
đi.
that smelled
Nào
like
ngủ
every
cho
Sunday
sâu ấy.
dinner he had ever wished he'd had.
Nó cày mấy
She was
củ
in
ngủ
her
sâu
usual
ấy.
place. The afternoon light fell across the sidewalk at a long angle, and she sat in it with her
Thế
eyes
thì
half
dậy được
closed,
rồi, không xứng
her
đáng ngủ
hands
thêm.
folded over the
Dậy được
notebook in her
chơi.
lap, looking less like a woman without a home, and more like someone who had simply chosen very deliberately to be exactly where she was. She opened her eyes when she heard him
Hỏi
come.
cho mặt
3
bảo ấy, cái đi
times,
cò thì
she
không.
said. A man comes 3 times, that means something. It means I found a good restaurant, he said, and sat down beside her. They ate slowly. The
Nghe hợp
gumbo
lý,
was the
nghe
kind
hợp lý.
that took days to build dark roux okra, the kind of depth
Chưa,
that
không biết
can
là
only come from patience
Đó là
And
bắt
she
đầu
closed her
đi
eyes,
rửa
and
mà.
the first
Nó cũng ngủ
spoonful the
như
way
mày
people
ấy. Bây
do
giờ nó dậy nó
when
rửa
a
mà.
taste reaches somewhere deeper than the mouth.
Có
She
cả là
told
bạn
him
đầu đến
about
đêm phải không?
training, the
Bây
way
giờ
she
nó
was
dậy nó rửa
told
mà.
100 times, to
Cậy mà.
students and neighbors and anyone who would sit still long enough. But she told it like it was the first
Được
time,
rồi, nó cậy
with the
mà
same
mắm
weight
tôm ăn
behind
thì nó
every
có
word,
hương vị
the
riêng.
same conviction that these things mattered and needed to be said. The musicians who had practiced on these streets for generations. The Mardi Gras Indians who had sewn their suits by hand in back rooms
Hương vị
and
nó đặc
emerged
trưng.
every year
Hiểu
in
không? Cứ
colors
mình mà
that
nhắm
made the
tôm
whole
mà mắm
city
tôm mà mua
stop.
về hàng công nghiệp
The
thì cái nào là cái như
corn
thế nào? Làm
grocers
sao
and
có
the
gì đặc
barbershops
trưng?
and the churches that had held the neighborhood together through every flood and every forgetting. He listened. The afternoon moved around them. At some point,
Nên
her
ăn bánh
voice
mì và
slowed,
cô.
then stopped. Her head dropped forward slightly, the sudden, unguarded way that older people sometimes cross into sleep, as if the
Hey.
body simply decides without consultation. The notebook shifted in her lap. He reached out to steady it without thinking,
Thế à?
and in
Đây
doing
không có
so,
cháu à?
his fingers brushed
Con
against
bảo,
something tucked
thì
inside the back
không
cover,
không làm ăn
the
cái gì cả
edge of
vợ
an
nó sẽ
envelope,
nhịn ngay.
old paper, the color of weak
Giá
tea,
trị của bạn.
soft with age
Giá trị của
and
bạn.
handling.
À có mì đi ăn.
He would
Ăn
have
mì
let
đi.
it go, would have simply straightened the notebook and set it back in her lap and
Tốt
looked
rồi.
away,
Tốt rồi
except
thì,
that his eyes caught the writing
chắc
on
là
the
cái ăn bún đậu
before he
thôi.
could redirect them. 4 words in a hand he did not recognize. Jimmy, if you ever find this. He did not
Tốt
move
rồi thì chắc là ăn bún đậu rồi.
Around him, the street continued its Saturday afternoon business. A car rolling slowly past, music from somewhere down the block.
Thế bạn
A child on a bicycle navigating the
mấy giờ ăn
uneven
được á?
sidewalk on the other
Cứ
side of
ăn
the
sớm
street.
được, hôm nay ăn
He
sớm
was
được,
aware
để
of
chiều
none
ta
of
lại về
it.
sớm
He
đón
looked
con.
at the envelope for what felt like several minutes, but was probably 30 seconds. Then,
Được,
with
cái
the
nhịn luôn
particular
đi.
care of someone handling something that does not belong to them
10 giờ bắt
and
đầu bán
belongs to
rồi.
them completely, he lifted it free. The flap was not sealed. It had been opened and refolded so many
Ăn
times
sớm vậy.
that the adhesive had given up
Thế
years
nhá,
ago.
bạn quay tay đi.
He unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was hers. He knew it without knowing how. He knew it. The same way
Bạn
he
có
had
mang
known
ghế
it
không?
on the
Bạn
steps of
đút
his
luôn ghế vào
building 4
đây.
days ago.
Bạn đút luôn ghế
Jimmy,
vào đây.
I don't know if this will ever reach you.
Lại
I have
quên.
written it 4 times.
Thế nhá.
And this is
Đây
the
đây
version
có
I
gì
am
hỏi thăm em
keeping,
Thảo ra cái nhé.
because the others didn't say it right. After they took you, I went to the welfare office on Tulane Avenue.
Rồi,
They
bạn đi
told
lựa
me
đây.
your case was closed
Đấy.
and they could not share placement information. I went back the following week and the week after that. I wrote letters to the district office and the state office and one to the governor that I don't believe anyone read. I found out you had been placed in Baton Rouge, and then I lost that trail. I don't know where you are now. I don't know if you are warm. I don't know if whoever has you is teaching you anything worth knowing. I want you to know that the 3 years you were here were not nothing. They were not a small thing that happened between other things. They were some of the best years of my life, and I am a woman who has had a good life, so that means something. I want you to know that you played that song better than you think you did. If you ever find this, and I don't know how you will, but I have learned not to argue with the things I hope for. I want you to know that I looked. I want you to know that leaving was not something I chose. You were never easy to forget me. Not for a single day. Miss B. He folded the letter along its original creases, with hands that were not entirely steady. He slid it back into the envelope. He placed the envelope back inside the notebook, exactly as he had found it, and set the notebook gently on the rack. She was still sleeping. Her breathing was slow and even. Her face relaxed in the particular piece of someone who had made a long acquaintance with difficulty and learned to rest where rest was available. He sat beside her on the sidewalk as the afternoon light turned and the city moved around them, and he did not speak, and he did not leave, and he did not try to name what was happening in his chest, because some things are too large to name while they are still happening. She had been looking for him the whole time, I never knew, and the letter had been waiting through floods and shelters and 30 years of loss for the moment he was ready to leave. Vincent Ardoin kept his office on the 30th floor of a building he owned outright, which was the kind of detail that told you everything you needed to know about how he moved through the world, not as a tenant, not as a partner in some larger project, but as the person whose name was on the deed. The office itself was what you would expect from a man who had spent 30 years accumulating the kind of wealth that eventually stops needing to announce itself and starts simply existing as atmosphere. Dark wood floor-to-ceiling shelves of books that may or may not have been read, a desk the size of a small country. The view from the windows looked out over the river in one direction and the downtown skyline in the other. And on a clear Sunday morning, like this one, with the city still quiet and the light coming in clean and low, it was objectively beautiful. James set the document on the desk without preamble. A single page, the authorization form for the Riverside Quarter acquisition, with the list of displaced addresses and the signature at the bottom. Vincent looked at it. Then he looked at James. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had learned early how to project confidence as a substitute for explanation. He had been James's partner for 7 years. James had trusted that face. "You came in on a Sunday," Vincent said. "I came in when I was ready," James said. "Not before." Vincent leaned back in his chair. He did not reach for the document. He did not perform surprise, which told James that surprise was not something Vincent was feeling.
Vâng,
What is it you want me to say?
chỗ ngõ
Vincent asked.
60
I
mà
want
em
you to
chưa
tell
tìm
me
được số nhà
how many
20.
properties, how many years, and I want you to tell me you understand what you were doing to the people who owned them. Vincent was quiet for a
đầu
moment.
ngõ
Outside
60,
a barge
đầu
moved
ngách
slowly
60
down the
ngay
river,
ngõ 3
low in the
81 đấy.
water, taking its time. What I was doing, he said finally,
Đây em đứng đầu ngay
was
kia rồi.
development. The same thing we have both been doing since we started this company together. You want to draw a line somewhere in the middle and call everything on one side of it legitimate and everything on the other side of it something else. But the line is one you're drawing after the fact, James. The methodology was aggressive. I won't pretend otherwise, but aggressive is not the same as wrong. Elderly homeowners, some of them in those houses for 40, 50 years. Assessment errors that weren't errors. Assessment processes that identified undervalued assets. That's a careful way to say it. I'm a careful person. James looked at him across the desk. This man, he had built something with whose instincts he had relied on, whose judgment he had trusted, with decisions that affected hundreds of people and hundreds of millions of lives. He thought about the folder people had given him. He thought about 40 to 50 copies. He thought about the letter quoted in one naked on the sidewalk of the train. Your father, James said. Harold Ardorn.
Alo.
He was the deputy director.
Trong
of the
người
city
to
planning.
thế nào là về chưa, như thế nào ở Việt hay nhà?
Something shifted in Vincent's expression.
Thuê được phòng chưa?
The kind of shift
Thuê được phòng
that a
chưa?
person makes when they realize a conversation has moved
Vì
into
bố tự thuê là bố không bao giờ thuê.
That's
Tưởng
correct.
anh
Vincent
tưởng
said.
giàu ra quyết tâm thuê.
I was part of the
Bố tự
task
thuê là bố
force
không bao giờ thuê.
that oversaw post-storm use decisions of betrayal and the self-care.
Thế sáng có lên không? Sáng có lên nào?
Displaced families.
Thế là gì không? Thế gặp bác sĩ chưa?
The same neighborhoods. Your acquisition plan.
Mấy giờ lên mà nó rất đuổi.
The room was very quiet. My mother, James said, and his voice was level. The way a voice gets level when the alternative is something it cannot afford to be passed away in federal emergency shelter outside that room. She had been strong through the water and the waiting when everything had come in.
Là cũng
The shelter was where her body finally decided to
Tập vàng.
She was 34 years old. I was 8. He left her. The clearance orders your father signed were part of what determined that our neighborhood was not a priority for early recovery resources. I have known that for a long time.
Tưởng thuê được rồi để chiều em mà em thẩm cái phòng em ngủ nhờ bữa. Chưa ngủ nhờ.
He picked up the
Mà tưởng thuê được rồi để buổi trưa em ngủ nhờ bữa.
What I am
Chưa
not
thuê
going
được
to make
thôi.
peace with, he said, is the continuation of that same logic by different people. Dressed up in acquisition strategy
Đấy.
and holding companies
Yên tâm, bố còn lâu.
development. Vincent stood. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has held a
Đi
position
Thả Thiên đúng không?
that he has stopped being related to distinction.
Đấy nhá, em bảo cả khách rồi. Xin chào bye bye.
When the old makes way for the new. That is not cruelty. That is how cities work. It has always been. James looked at him for a long moment. My mother died in a federal emergency shelter, he said quietly, because people like your father decided what was old and what was new. He folded the document and placed it in his jacket pocket. Then he walked to this door, opened it, and left without looking back. The elevator was waiting. He stepped in, and as the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the polished metal. A man in a suit on a Sunday morning, holding a folded piece of paper with an expression on his face that he did not entirely recognize. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the look of a person who has finally located, after a very long search, the exact coordinates of where they stand. For the first time in 15 years, he knew exactly who he was. The report came through at 5:30 in the afternoon. A document attached to a text from Cooper, with no message, because Cooper understood that the document was the message. James, read it twice, in the parking garage, beneath his building, sitting in his car, with the engine off and the concrete walls of the structure pressing in from every side. Raymond Arsenault, 46 years old, a processing coordinator at a property documentation firm that handled title transfers, eviction filings, and municipal acquisition paperwork for clients across the greater New Orleans area. The report included his address, an apartment complex in Bywater, the neighborhood just downriver from the French Quarter, the kind of place where working people had lived for generations and were still, for the moment, managing to stay. James drove there without calling him in. He did not know exactly what he was going to say. He knew only that there was a man who shared a last name with a woman sitting on a sidewalk in Tremé, and that between them there was a gap that the paperwork could not fully explain, and that he was at this point the only person on earth who might be able to see the whole picture. The complex was 2 stories, brick with a parking lot that needed resurfacing, and a row of mailboxes near the entrance, some of them missing their doors. Unit 214 was on the 2nd floor at the end of a corridor that smelled faintly of someone's Sunday dinner, something with onions and baby, the kind of smell that made a hallway feel briefly like a home. He knocked. A long pause, then footsteps, then silence, the kind that meant someone was standing on the other side to side. The door opened to a chain-locked split. The man who looked through the gap was broad-shouldered and cautious, with the kind of face that had learned wariness, not from paranoia, but from experience. He was wearing a work shirt with a company logo on the chest, even on a Sunday, which said something about the kind of person he was. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat and careful. "My name is James Delacroix. I'm a developer. I'm not here about business," James said. "I'm here about your mother." The eye visible through the gap did not move. "My mother, Viola Arsenault. I believe she's your mother." Another pause, longer pause. "What about her?" "She's been living on the streets in Toronto for the past 18 years. I've been spending time with her this past week. She doesn't know I'm here." The chain came off. The door opened. Raymond Arsenault, property processing coordinator, son of Viola. Arsenault, a man who had not seen his son in a period of time that his expression suggested he had spent considerable energy, not calculating, stood in the doorway, looked at James with an expression that was equal parts calm, something rawer underneath, something that had been waiting a long time to be disturbed. "You'd better come in." The apartment was small and lonely, in the way that a person stays, comes to when they live alone and decide that order is the thing. A kitchen table next to a chair, a bookshelf, a week's worth of work orders stacked together. Raymond gestured toward the table without looking, and James nodded. I explained what he knew about Viola, where she was staying, what her days looked like, how she was managing. He kept his voice even, his language firm. Raymond sat across from him, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, listening with the posture of a man who was hearing things he had suspected and had worked very hard not to hear. "She told me she was fine," Raymond said when James finished. "Last time we spoke, she said she had a place. She said she was managing. That was before the eviction." Raymond said nothing. James reached into the folder with a little hand. He set a document on the table between them, not the full acquisition list, just the single page. The processing record for municipal acquisition order number 247, the property address of the tenant, the chain of handling notations, and near the bottom, the coordinator signed process hundreds of files a week. His voice had gone. I never look at files. I review the documentation for completeness, and I sign off, and I move to the next one. Stop. I didn't know. I know you didn't. She never told me she lost the house. She was ashamed, James said. She didn't want you to see her. Raymond closed his eyes. He sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening with a document in front of him that he could not take back, and a truth he could not unknow. And he stayed like that for long enough that the onion and bay leaf smell from somewhere down the corridor drifted through the silence like something from another life. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. Not dry clear. The kind of clear that comes after something is broken open and the person has decided in real time what they are going to do. Take me to her, he said. They went downstairs together and got into James's car without discussing logistics or timing or what would happen when they arrived. Raymond sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees, looking straight ahead through the windshield as the Bywater streets gave way to the marina and then to Tremé, the neighborhoods sliding past the windows in the Sunday evening. James drove and said nothing. Raymond sat and said nothing. Between them, in the quiet, two men carried two different kinds of work toward the same destination. One that had been searching without knowing it, and one that had been avoiding without admitting it, both of them moving finally in any direction that ever made sense. They parked 2 blocks away without discussing it, as if both of them understood that whatever was about to happen deserved to be approached on. James walked in. Raymond followed at a distance, his hands in his jacket pockets, his steps slowing as they turned home. She was there, settled into her corner, where Daphne met the cross street, her coat around her
Alo, xin em xin chào. Bạn ơi, mình đón bạn ở bên công viên Thủ Lệ hay là bên giao thông vận tải nhỉ?
soft and focus of someone whose mind was traveling somewhere.
Ok, bạn chờ mình tí nha.
Today, the dog was speaking.
Ok.
She looked at James with an expression that suggested she was located through something dense and slowly. You came back, she said softly. I always come back, he said. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had believed, but not been certain of. They sat together in the quiet of the late afternoon, the city moving gently around them, a screen door somewhere, a dog, the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood going about its evening. James did not plan what happened next. He began to hum, low, almost inaudible, the first few notes of the melody she had taught him 30 years ago in a candlelit front room on a rainy Tremé night. The simple rolling pattern she had called a New Orleans lullaby, the song he had never hummed to himself in all the years between then and now, because it had belonged to a version of himself he had spent a long time trying to live. He offered it to the air quietly, and then she began to hum it, not looking at him, looking at the same unfixed point she had been watching when he arrived. Her voice came in the second place, soft and certain, finding each note the way water finds the lowest point, not by searching, but by simply going where it was always done. The melody moved between them above the warm pavement of the train, and she remembered everything. James kept humming. His throat was tight. He kept humming on. She let the melody accompany his first whole time. Then she stopped. The silence that followed.
Anh
said it the way you say the name of something you thought you had lost quietly, with a kind of wonder that has no performance. Raymond, he crossed the distance in 3 steps and went to his knees on the sidewalk in front of her. She put both hands on either side of his face. Neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying in this moment, and everything that needed saying would take longer than a moment, and they both understood this, and it was all right. James moved back against the wall a few feet away and looked at the street. The 3 of them stayed like that as the light gave way to them. Nobody spoke. The city moved around them, cars and footsteps, and the distant sound of trumpet 3 blocks away, and none of it touched them. Above them, the first stars appeared over New Orleans. The city hummed its ancient song. 3 weeks passed. The way, recovery passes, not in dramatic leaps, but in the accumulation of small things that taken individually seem almost too modest to count. The apartment was on the ground floor of a building on Ursulines Avenue, half a block from the edge of the center block. It had 2 windows that faced the street, which is large enough for one person to fit in, and a bathroom with good clean water. It was not large. It was not impressive by any measure that a real estate developer would use to evaluate the property. But when Viola Arsenault walked through its door for the first time on a Tuesday morning, with her early morning, she stopped in the middle of the front room and stood very still. And the expression on her face was the one that appears when a body recognizes safety, before the mind has finished processing the information. Raymond had painted it the week before. A warm, off-white, the color of old cream, the color of walls that had been lived in. He had put curtains on the windows, simple ones and hot. Let the morning light in, without making a fortune. The piano arrived on the first. Raymond had spent 11 days tracking it down, calling storage facilities, municipal warehouses, salvage companies that handled property from evictions, explaining to each of them what he was looking for and why, until he found it in the warehouse, a gentleman, still in the same condition, one of the lower people had worn for years ago. The bench was missing its leg, but it propped up with a stack of old things. Raymond repaired the bench himself on a Saturday afternoon in the parking lot of the warehouse before loading it into a borrowed truck. When Viola saw it, sitting against the wall of her new front room, she did not say anything. She crossed to it slowly and sat down on the bench and placed both hands in her lap and lifted the key for a long time without touching it. Then she reached out and pressed one key with her right index finger. The note was slightly off. The humidity had done its work over 18 months, but it was close enough to prove that it carried. It moved through the small apartment and out the open window and into the November morning, and for a moment the street outside went about its business as though a piano note drifting through a ground floor window were the most ordinary thing in the world, which in Tremé it very nearly was. She pressed another key, then another. Then she folded her hands back in her lap and sat quietly, and Raymond, who had been standing in the doorway watching her, did not say anything either, because some things do not need commenting. Her doctor came twice a week. Dr. Simone Charles was a geriatric specialist, a compact, direct woman in her late 40s who had spent 20 years working with elderly patients in New Orleans and had developed over that time the particular combination of clinical precision and unhurried patience that the work required. She had reviewed Viola's records from the free clinic, adjusted her medications, and established a treatment plan that addressed not only the cognitive symptoms, but the malnutrition and joint pain that 18 months without consistent care had accumulated. She explained everything to Raymond in plain language and answered his questions without complaint. The good days came more frequently than the difficult ones, though the difficult ones still arrived without warning. Mornings when Viola woke uncertain of the month afternoons, when familiar names slipped just out of reach. On those days, Raymond would sit with her at the kitchen table, and they would talk about whatever she wanted to talk about, which was sometimes Tremé, and sometimes music, and sometimes nothing in particular. And he would stay until the fog lifted, or until she fell asleep, whichever came first. He came every day. not because he felt he owed it, though he understood that the ledger between them would take years to balance. He came because she was his mother, and she was here, and those two facts, taken together, were sufficient enough. James came on Thursdays. He did not come inside. He would arrive in the early evening and stand on the sidewalk outside the front window, and if the light was on and he could see movement inside, he would know that the day had been a good one, and that was enough. He told himself he was giving them space. He told himself that what had been rebuilt between a mother and a son in the week since that evening did not need a third-party present to remain real. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was that standing outside that window, watching the warm light of a small apartment where two people were finding their way back to each other, gave James Delacroix something he had not been able to name until now. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than happiness. The sense that something which had been broken for a very long time had been set carefully back into place. On the third Thursday, he arrived to find the window open and the apartment quiet. He was about to turn and leave when he heard it. She was playing the song, not fragments of it, not the hesitant singing, notes from the first day at the bench, the full melody from beginning to end, slow and slightly uneven,
Bạn phải ra khỏi phòng
but complete,
hít thở không khí
every
trong lành đi.
phrase finding its way
Bạn
home.
ở trong phòng mãi toàn mùi ấy.
On the sidewalk, the way it had once
Hít thở không khí
settled
trong lành
around
ấy.
a small
Ra
boy
ngoài bờ
in a
sông bờ
candlelit
ruộng
room,
thở.
and he stood very still and let it. He did
Ra
not
ngắm
go
vitamin
inside.
gái.
He stood on the
Thằng Will nó
sidewalk
vẫn là
of
có
Ursuline's
sông hơn
Avenue
bạn.
in the November evening and listened until the last note
Hả?
faded. And then he stood a little longer in the
Đang là Nguyễn
silence.
Khang ấy mà ế khách quá, gọi điện bạn
James
bảo để cho nó
Delacroix
xin
had built
vía.
towers across this city. He had
làm
never
chuyến đi nội
built anything
bài.
this important. The map had been on his desk for 4 days. Not the digital
Chính là
version.
kém 20
His
rồi,
team worked
18.
from the physical one printed at full scale, the kind that required both hands to
Ra
unfold
tính rồi, 3
and a
giờ
clear
bạn tóc đi
surface to
thì
spread
9 giờ là
across.
6 tiếng.
It showed the
bạn dậy
current
được
state
rồi, chắc
of
mình
every
rồi.
active Delacroix development project in the greater New Orleans area.
Thế đi dậy
Color-coded
đi,
by phase.
nào ngủ đéo
Green
sâu
for
ấy.
completed, yellow for in
Hoa cầy mấy
progress,
cổ ngủ
red
sâu
for
ấy.
pending acquisition. There was a lot of red in Treme. James had been coming in early, all week, before Keisha
Để
arrived,
đi dậy được
before
rồi,
the
không
phone
xứng đáng ngủ
started,
thêm.
before the
Dậy
building
chơi.
filled with the sounds of people
Chụp.
doing the work he had built his life around. He would sit at his desk with the map and his coffee, in the particular quiet of an office, before the day was claimed, and he would look at the red sections and think about what they represented, not in the language of development, not in square footage and projected returns and displacement reports, but in the other language, the one he had spent the better part of a week rediscovering on the sidewalks of Treme. 47
Giờ
properties.
nó bắt đầu
He had
là
asked
rửa
Cooper
mà.
to give him a
Nó cũng ngủ
final
như
count.
mày ấy. Giờ nó dậy nó
47
rửa
families,
mà.
elderly owners, most of them in
Có
those
cả là bạn
homes,
đầu đến đêm phải không?
but
Bây
in
giờ nó
life,
dậy nó rửa mà.
displaced through a process
Cậy mà.
that wore the clothing of legality, while doing the work of something else entirely. He thought about the woman on the
Được
steps
rồi, nó
of
cậy
his
mà
building
mắm tôm
on a
ăn
Wednesday
nó có hương vị
afternoon
riêng.
in October. The worn notebook, the thin coat, the shoes held together by more hope than material. He had built the building she was sitting in front of. He had never once
Hương
thought
vị nó
of
đặc
what it
trưng.
would be.
Hiểu không? Cứ về mà
Thought
nhắm
about
tôm
a
là
letter
mắm tôm mà
written
mua về
4
hàng công nghiệp thì cái nào nó sẽ như
and
thế
kept
nào?
for
Làm
30
sao có gì
years.
đặc trưng?
In a notebook carried through floodwaters and shelter cots, in 18 months of sidewalks and doorways. He thought about what it meant to look for someone
Ra
that
đứng
long
nghỉ và
without
cô.
stopping. He thought about what she had told a boy of 8 years old on a rainy November night, standing back from her own doorway to make
Đấy.
room. You're safe now. 2 words. No conditions attached. No calculation of cost or return.
Thế à? Đây
Just a
không có
door
cháu à?
open and a step
Không con bảo.
taken back,
Ồ, gì à?
and a child
Không
brought
làm
in
ăn
out
cái
of the
gì cái là vợ
rain.
nó
He
sẽ
folded
nhìn
the
ngay.
map. The board meeting was at 10.
Giá
He
trị
had
của
called
bạn.
it himself, which was
Giá trị
unusual.
của bạn. À, có
And
mì
he
đi
had
ăn.
not shared
Ăn
an
mì đi.
agenda which made Keisha look at him with the measured concern of someone who
Tất rồi
has
đấy.
learned to read
Tất
the
rồi thì,
space around a person's
chắc là cái bún
decisions
đậu thôi.
rather than the decisions themselves. He told her it would be fine. She nodded in the way that
Tất
meant
rồi
she
thì chắc là bún
believed
đậu rồi.
and was reserving judgment simultaneously. There were 7 people around the table when he walked
Hợp
in.
lý ấy nhỉ?
His legal counsel, his chief financial officer,
Thế bạn
3 senior partners, Two
Bây giờ ăn
independent
được
board
á,
members whose
cứ
role
ăn
was
sớm
in
được,
theory
hôm nay ăn sớm được,
to
tại
ask the
chiều ta lại về
questions
sớm đón
no
con.
one else was willing to ask. He stood at the head of the table and told them what he had found. He did not soften
Được,
it.
nhịn luôn
He
đi.
did not use the language that turns difficult facts into
10 giờ
acceptable
bắt đầu bán rồi.
abstractions. He laid out Cooper's findings, the pattern of assessment manipulation across 47 properties, the connection to our
Ăn sớm
and
nhỉ?
his own will. However,
Thế nhá,
inadvertent
vẫn quay
in a
tay đi.
process that had displaced dozens of elderly homeowners from neighborhoods they had built their lives inside. The room was quiet.
Bạn có mang
and the
ghế
day
không?
was goodbye.
Bạn đút luôn ghế vào
When something
đi.
has been
Bạn đút
said,
luôn ghế vào đi.
it cannot be unsaid. Then he told them
Mày
what he
quên.
was going to do about it.
Thế
He
nhá.
was dissolving
Đây,
the
có gì hỏi thăm em
partnership
Thảo
with
ra cái
R.
nhé.
Dwayne Holdings, effective immediately. He was commissioning an independent legal review
Rồi,
of
đi
every
lượn đây.
acquisition that had passed
Đấy.
through that partnership over the past 6 years. He was using his personal holdings, not company funds, his own, to repurchase the 47 properties at fair market value and return title to their original owners or their families, where the owners were no longer living. And he was establishing a nonprofit land trust to be called the Treme Land Trust, with a mandate to protect long-term, affordable homeownership in historically black neighborhoods across the city. One of the independent board members asked what this would cost him personally. James looked at the question for a moment before answering. More than the building I put my name on last year, he said. Less than it would cost me not to. No one said anything after that. The legal work took 2 weeks. The paperwork for the land trust was filed on a Thursday morning. By the following Monday, the first file had been transferred back to their original owners, and the story had found its way into the local press in the understated way that stories sometimes do when the facts are complicated enough to resist simple framing. Raymond came to the land trust's first official meeting, a small gathering in a borrowed conference room with folding chairs and a card table and a coffee maker that produced coffee of uncertain quality. He sat in the back row and listened to the organizational framework being discussed, and at the end, when James asked other questions, Raymond raised his hand. I'd like to help, he said. I know the filing systems. I know where the errors were made. A pause. I know how to fix them. James looked at him across the room. We'd be glad to have you, he said. Outside, the November city went about its business, indifferent and alive, and full of people who did not yet know that something had shifted quietly in the way a small piece of it worked. That was all right. The work did not require an audience. I didn't do it for the cameras. I did it because a woman had once opened her door to a soaking wet 8-year-old boy in the middle of a hurricane and asked for nothing in return. The title transfer, paperwork, for 4417 Dauphine Street was processed on a Wednesday morning, and James signed it alone in his office, with no one else present except Keisha, who witnessed it and then left the room without being asked, because she understood, as she usually did, what a moment required. He drove to Dauphine Street afterward, not because the signing required his physical presence at the property, it didn't, but because some things need to be stood in front of before they can be fully understood. The house was a classic, Treme shotgun, narrow and deep. Its facade painted a pale yellow that had weathered to something closer to cream. It had a small front porch with an iron railing, 2 front windows with wooden shutters, and a door painted green, the same green it had been for as long as anyone on the block could remember. The garden out front had gone to overgrowth in the 18 months since Viola had left, but the bones of it were still there, the raised beds. She had built herself the path of flat stones, leading to the porch steps a rosebush along the left side that had continued doing what rosebushes do, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. James stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time. He thought about the paperwork, 47 files, 47 families,
Vâng, xin em xin chào,
47
chưa em
sets
đến
of
là chỗ
hands
ngõ
that had
60 mà
maintained these
em chưa tìm thấy
properties
số nhà
through
20.
storms and recessions, and the slow grind of years. He thought about what it meant that a system could strip something like this away
đầu ngõ
through the
60,
accumulation of
đầu ngách
forms and
60
fees
ngay ngõ 3
and unanswered
81 này.
letters, and how that same system, pushed hard enough
Đây em đứng đầu
in
ngách
the
đây rồi.
right direction, could occasionally be made to give it back. The story found the press before he had decided whether to share it. A local journalist who covered housing issues had had been tracking the Riverside Quarter acquisition for months and had noticed in the public filings the unusual pattern of reversals. She called Keisha on a Tuesday, and by Thursday morning, the story had run measured, specific, grounded in documentation. And by Friday, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. The coverage was careful. It described what had happened in Tremé and the 7th Ward in Central City in the language of policy and practice, which was the accurate language, the language that made clear this was not the story of one bad actor, but of a set of incentives and processes that had been operating largely unexamined for years. Displacement through tax manipulation, the systematic erosion of black homeownership in neighborhoods whose cultural value the city celebrated, while the economic machinery beneath it was doing something else entirely. Vincent's
Alo.
was mentioned.
Trong buổi đầu thế nào là về chưa? Như thế nào ở Việt hay nhỉ? Thuê được phòng chưa? Thuê được phòng chưa?
He had agreed to do it. What was built on these
Vì bố tự thuê là bố không bao giờ thuê.
we were wrong to think otherwise.
Tưởng anh, tưởng đầu ra quyết tâm thôi.
He had written the sentence himself and read it back to his friends before approving it. He wanted it to be accurate. He did not tell Viola it was not his news to deliver. He had thought about
Thế là
this.
điều. Các bác kia.
When you think about something, when you understand that the manner of the thing matters,
Bây giờ lên mà nó rất vậy.
he had concluded that the right person to stand in the kitchen and say your house is yours was the person who had grown up with Raymond on a Saturday afternoon. Viola was at the kitchen table, working on a puzzle, something Raymond had bought her didn't before, thousand pieces, a photograph of the New Orleans French Quarter.
Là cũng không có
And he sat down across from her and waited until she looked up. He told her something. The house on Dublin Street. The title had been transferred back. It was hers. She looked at him for a moment, without speaking. Outside the window, was Charlie, was riding a bicycle up and down the sidewalk.
Tưởng thuê được rồi để chiều em mà em ở cái phòng em ngủ nhờ bữa. Chưa ngủ
A
nhờ.
pigeon landed on the window.
Tưởng thuê được rồi để buổi trưa vào ngủ nhờ
Viola
bữa.
looked back at
Chưa thuê được
her. Take me
thôi.
to see it, she said. They drove the 6 blocks together, which was close enough to walk, but neither of them suggested walking. Raymond parked in front and
Yên
came
tâm,
down to open her
bố
door,
còn lâu.
which she accepted without comment, which told him something about how much the moment was costing her to hold together. She stood on the sidewalk,
Em đi Thái Phiên đúng không?
down the street, the green door.
Đấy nhá, em bận cả khách rồi. Xin chào bye bye chiều.
She took one step forward, then another. She climbed the 2 porch steps slowly, and close behind her, but not. She stood at the door and raised her right hand and placed her palm flat against the painted wood, the way you place your hand on the shoulder of someone you have been afraid to find. She stood like that for a long time. Raymond stood behind her on the porch and looked at the street and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, but the moment was not already saying for itself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and certain and aimed at the door rather than at him. I knew you'd wait for me, she said. The rain started around 4 in the afternoon. Not the dramatic kind that New Orleans sometimes produces, but a gentle, persistent kind. The kind that softens the edges of the city and makes the streets smell like wet brick and old wood and something indefinably itself. By the time James arrived at the apartment on Ursulines Avenue, the kitchen windows had fogged slightly from the inside, and the light coming through them onto the wet sidewalk was the color of warm honey. Raymond had been cooking since 2. He had called his mother 3 times that week to ask about quantities and timing, how long the roux needed, when to add the trinity, whether the okra went in before or after the tomatoes. She had answered each question with the patient precision of someone transferring something important, and he had written everything down in a notebook he had brought specifically for the purpose, because he understood that some knowledge deserves to be treated like what it is. The table was set for 3. Mismatched plates, mismatched glasses, 2 candles in holders that had clearly come from different sets. Raymond had found them in a box in the back of a kitchen cabinet and lit them without remarking on the fact that this was the first time they had been used in a very long time. James sat down across from Viola, who was wearing a cardigan the color of deep water and had her hair pinned up the way she wore it she considered the occasion worth the effort. She looked in the candlelight like herself, not the woman on the steps of his building in October, not the figure in the fog in the corner of Docking at dusk, but the woman she had always been underneath all of it, the one who had stood back from a doorway 30 years ago to make room. Raymond set the food on the table. The gumbo was dark and complex, built on a roof that had taken 40 minutes of patient storms and smelled like every Sunday the neighborhood had ever lived. There was potato salad and skillet cornbread and a dish of red beans that Raymond admitted when fast had not turned out exactly as his mother made it. Viola tasted it and considered. Close, she said. Close, he repeated. Close is how you start, she said. They ate slowly, the rain tapping at the kitchen window in its gentle, unhurried way. Viola told a story about a student she had taught in the 1980s, a boy of 11 who had arrived at her door, convinced he had no musical ability, and had spent 6 months proving himself wrong, one painful note at a time. He had played the concerts to a standing ovation, and then walked to the public because he didn't know when he was supposed to come. She told him the time he had said he had told her where the people lived. Raymond laughed at the right moment, and James laughed. Not the managed laugh he produced in conference rooms and at business deals, the real one, the one that starts somewhere lower and arrives without permission. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing when the plates had been cleared and the candles had been burnt out. A quarter of their length, Viola pushed out the kitchen door. She moved through the kitchen door into the front room, the way she always moved, without announcing herself, without requiring the room to adjust. Sat down. Raymond leaned against the kitchen door. James stayed at the table. And then, without deciding to, he got up. He sat down beside her, not in the way of a man who has made a decision, in the way of a child who has simply gone to the place where he belongs, without calculation, without the careful management of himself that had governed most of his adulthood. He sat down the way he had sat down 30 years ago, on a bench in a candlelit front room in Tremaine. When a woman had patted the space beside him, he said softly. Viola placed her hands on the keys. She played the song, all of it, from the first rolling phrase to the last, slow and unhurried, each note finding its place the way it always did, the way it would continue to after all of them were gone. The song itself, the way songs do, was pure silence. The rain beat against them. The candles from the kitchen threw their light through the doorway, warm and steady. Raymond stood with his shoulder against the curtain and his arms at his sides and watched his mother play. When the last note came, Viola kept her hands on the keys. Then she turned and looked at James and said, "You still sing off key?" she asked. He smiled. "Not the measure one, the other one. Every single note." She nodded slowly with the satisfaction of someone receiving the answer they were hoping. "Good," she said. "Don't ever change that." The rain continued its quiet work against the window. The candles burned. The piano held its last note. The way the river holds everything ever been given to it, without judgment, without condition, simply keeping what it has been trusted with until the moment it is needed. The three of them stayed as they were. Nobody moved. Nobody needed to. There is something the rain does to you that it doesn't do anywhere else. It softens things. It brings the smell of the river up through the streets and into the neighborhoods, and for a little while, everything that has been sharp and separate and difficult feels like it belongs to the same larger thing. That is what this story has been trying to say, in its way, that we belong to the same larger thing, that the people who shape us are part of us, long after the distance has grown, long after the years have accumulated, long after we have built entire lives that seem from the outside to have nothing to do with a candlelit room and an old piano and a woman who stepped back from her door to meet me. Viola's story is not unusual. That is the most important thing to understand. Right now, in the United States, more than 500,000 people are experiencing homelessness on any given night. Among the fastest growing groups cities across this country, neighborhoods like Treme neighborhoods built by Black families over generations, neighborhoods with deep cultural roots and community memory that no development proposal can replicate.
Alo, xin em xin
Are
chào.
being
Bạn ơi, mình đón bạn ở
reshaped
bên
by economic forces
công viên Thủ Lệ hay là
that
bên
move
giao thông vận
faster
tải nhỉ?
than the people inside them can respond to. Property
Ok,
tax,
ok, bạn chờ mình tí nha.
crime, assessment processes
Ok, ok.
that disadvantage long-term owners, the slow replacement of community with commodity. These are not abstract problems. They have names and addresses and front porches and piano benches. They have notebooks carried through floodwaters. They have songs that somebody taught somebody else on a rainy night when the teaching was the only thing either of them had to offer. The river remembers everything. The question is whether we do. If this story moved something, and I hope it did, there are things worth doing with that feeling. Look into organizations working on elderly homelessness in your city. Look into housing advocacy groups working to protect long-term homeowners from displacement. If you have ever benefited from the care of someone who was never adequately compensated for that care, a nanny, a foster parent, a neighbor who showed up when your own family couldn't consider what it might mean to find, to call, to say the thing you have been meaning to say. You do not need a dramatic reunion on a sidewalk. You do not need 30 years of distance to make the gesture meaningful. Sometimes the most important thing a person can hear is simply that they were not forgotten, that the time they gave, that somewhere out there someone still cares what they offer. Don't wait. If this story reached you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell us about someone who shaped you. Every story matters, and so does yours. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, so you don't miss what's coming
Anh
next,
Minh Nguyễn Khang ấy.
these stories exist because you watch them, because you share them, and because you believe, as I do, that the kind of content that asks something real of us is worth looking at. The heart doesn't need to be in tune to be heard. It just needs someone willing to listen. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.